Well, and I guess that leads us to what we can talk about there, as I titled it in our little notes, that time we got shot up.
Hmm.
Um, so Christmas Day, 2006, um, we got engaged pretty heavily. And I was thinking about it, you and I never really talked about it. I think we
Mm,
talked about it sort of in passing, just like little moments, but we never actually like shared notes, I guess you could say, about it.
sure.
And
Yeah.
granted, it was a
Yeah.
long time ago, but I thought
Hmm.
it'd be interesting to kind of just go down that because the older I get, I realize my memory isn't what I thought it was.
Right.
And so things change over time. And of course, I was doped up for most of that day anyway.
Hmm.
Um,
Before we took off. Yeah.
well, you weren't supposed to say, but yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's talk about that because I'm interested to hear your side of things beyond what I remember you telling me. But again, I think honestly, I think the only time we really talked about it, I was still laying in the hospital bed, so I was
Mm,
definitely on drugs.
yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so you probably were green and had like horns or something like in my memory, just like because I was so doped up. But so that day we went on a morning flight. What do you remember like leading up to us taking off?
So yeah, Christmas Day. The general sentiment of at that time was, hey, it's Christmas. We're going to kind of keep operations to a minimum. In the wintertime, the fighting was a little bit less. I mean, not crazy, but typically when it got colder, there were kind of fair weather fighters, right? So it had been kind of quiet, and it was Christmas, and like we do, we try to say, okay, on Christmas Day, let's try to give folks, let's not make them as stressful as it possibly can for them, right? Let's try to give folks a break. Excuse me. So we went out, and at the time we had basically during our windows of flight, we had different areas that the intel folks or the operational folks would tell us, hey, go take a look here. We heard this. Maybe, last night there were mortars from here. Maybe go check it out. All sorts of stuff. So, um, and I just remember very specifically, we were just like, okay, we're going to go up. It had been pretty quiet the last, I don't know, week or so, 2 weeks, something like that. We said, okay, we'll go up, and it was daytime. It was broad daylight. I think it was morning time frame,
Yeah.
probably 8, 9, 10 o'clock, something like that, if I remember correctly. And we said, okay, we'll go up and we'll do an hour, right? We'll just go up and hit the areas. It had been pretty quiet, and so yeah, we did a team brief. We said we're going to go up. We're going to check out a few of the areas. Um, I remember we went up. We did kind of a counter clock or clockwise loop around the city, if I remember
Mm.
correctly. Um, I don't think we tried to hit stair step with the smoke grenade, but it wasn't at night, so it wasn't a challenge, right? So
That we got to remember to tell that story because that one I forgot about that. Oh my god. Yeah, we'll get to that.
yeah, yeah, we'll get to that one. But yeah, quiet. I mean, quiet on the radios because really, when you would go up, the first thing you do is you check in with the ground forces, right, and see if they needed any help. See because sometimes even just flying around, you can check out the high ground for them. You can, you're making noise, which tends to scare bad guys away, stuff like that. And I don't even think they were out. Like, I mean, it was
Yeah.
literally kind of a ghost town.
No, they
So
weren't.
yeah. So yeah, I just remember going out. We did that lap. We hit the north end of the city. We started working our way back, and I do remember very specifically about this. I mean, we couldn't have been more than 20 minutes into the flight, maybe. And I remember there was a section off to the northeast side of the city that it was it was very recognizable from the air. I think maybe because of the topography or something, but had been an absolute like that was where all the fighting was happening. I remember that. I mean, we had been in multiple engagements in that area before. The infantry guys had been engagements in that area before, all that kind of stuff. And so we said, okay, hey, we're not going to go in there. Not that we think anything's going to happen, but I just remember very specific because I was flying right seat at the time, and I remember I kind of looked across. I was like, okay, that's over there. And I don't know if I got too close to it or if they had moved or whatever, but I mean, I remember looking back being like, okay, we're going to fly over there now. And then that's just when I remember like literally the entire helicopter erupting, like literally
Yeah.
just erupting. And like the smell of gunpowder and like, all the dust and dirt and everything flying through the cockpit. And I mean, just everything, in, a second's time. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty much leading up to it. I mean, it happened just that fast.
Yeah, I remember that morning. Um, it was relatively early. I want to say we took off probably about 9, if I had to guess. Um, but I remember it's funny because you as the boss, right? You're the commander and you were dealing with Major Cheeks, who was the detachment OIC or whatever we're calling them. You know, you guys had your conversations and us warrant officers had our own conversation. I remember us being very surprised when we sat down for the brief and we started getting briefed on things to go look at. Like, oh, we want you to look at this. Because in our mind, it was like, well, it's a no roll day. Like, it's Christmas.
Mhm.
Like, the ground forces, like you said, are not out patrolling. If we go out, why are we out type thing.
Mhm.
And I remember Major Cheek saying, well, you know, we got to provide presents or something like that. I was like, okay. And it was weird because I remember Cody and I going out to the aircraft. We all did our pre-flights and stuff. And he just, I don't remember which one of us said it, but we both were like looking at each other. And one of us was like, I just don't feel good about today. And it's weird. Like, there's a few things, and we'll talk about another one here in a minute. There's just few things where you look back in retrospect and you're like, oh, that's like a foreshadowing moment. But at the time, you know,
Right. Yeah.
it's nothing. It is
Yeah.
what it is. But we both were like, well, this is, I don't know, just something feels wrong about today. And then what's funny is we had talked for months, I guess, at this point, about taking a team photo. We'd never
Yeah.
taken a team photo. And
Yep.
finally that day, I think you were like, we're doing it today. Like, we need to take
Yep.
this team photo. Jake, can you pull that up if you're there? So we took this probably within 30 minutes of us taking off. Nope, not that one. There we go. So we took this that morning. So we got Aaron on the left, we got Cody, we got you, and we got me on the right. So I thought that was very interesting in retrospect, and I'm glad that we did it because otherwise,
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
you know, otherwise we never would have got to.
Mhm.
Cody looking absolutely magnificent with his mustache,
Always spectacular.
just the Tom Selleck that he is, and then me off to the right with a mustache, but not quite as glorious. And
Hey,
Aaron with that
pencil thin works. Pencil thin works.
that ready to get after its scowl. But I wish that we had taken it in front of our aircraft because that would have been even more interesting and more fitting.
Apropos,
Okay,
yeah.
Jake, you can take that down. So we took that photo, good timing, and then we took off. And like you said, yeah, I remember taking off heading kind of northwest, it's like Red Trailer Road area and stuff. And so in my head, being the lazy bastard that I am, it's like, I just want to hang out outside the city. Like, they said they want us up for an hour. Okay, cool. We can do an hour. Let's just loop around the city. And I think I'm the one that suggested to you, like, well, why don't we go down to Palestine, which was all the way around if you were to fly around the city, like all the way down by the airfield. And that had been a rough neighborhood. And then over our time there, I think it got better. I think throwing candy at kids helped. I don't know. But
Right.
but I had suggested it, and in my head, for whatever reason, I thought you would kind of just like go all the way around, and you just started like blazing through, and I was like, all right, because I remember flying past the Uday and Kusei palaces or whatever, and so we blew through that, and then the same, just like you said, I remember us kind of cutting through, and you didn't get close to that area. And you know, the area you're talking about, you know, that's, you know, unfortunately where Matt Mattingly was killed. That's where we, like 3 weeks prior, had gotten to a big gunfight for like 4 hours. In fact, that was the first time I ever laid eyes on a no shit, that's a bad guy. I remember that dude. You know, army camouflage jacket with an AK in his hand, and I'm like, we're flying right over him, and I'm looking at him, and I'm like, that dude's got an AK. And then I hear, you know, and it was even on your GoPro. You had that GoPro set up and that helmet cam or whatever, and you could hear it. So that was a bad neighborhood. But yeah, the same thing you did, where I remember looking at that area, and there was that hill. Do you remember that like weird just hill? I don't know what the hell it was doing in the middle of the city. And it's still there because I saw it a few years ago. I remember seeing that, and we flew on the right side of it, which is good. We're far away. But I still remember thinking in my head at the time, I was like, I don't want to be over here. Like, in my mind, we were closer than we were. But I was like, how do I tell him, who's my boss, that I don't want to be here? And I remember literally looking out the left door at the mosque, right? Which we can tell the funny story about the mosque later as well, with the man pad. And so I'm looking at the mosque, and I'm thinking, how do I delicately say to him, let's get the fuck out of here? And as I'm turning my head that's when, just as you described, and we were low. I mean, we were, standard Kiowa shit. We were 100 feet, whatever. And the world just opened up. And I think about the times that we've all been shot at multiple times at this point, and since then, it's always like a rat-a-tat-tat if you hear anything. Because a lot of times, yeah, you come back, there's some holes in the aircraft. You're like, oh, no shit, when did that happen? This was like being on the gunning, like on a range. It
Yeah.
was loud. And like you said, I remember that gunpowder. I remember there just being like shit in the cockpit. Like, I don't even know why. Yeah,
Oh
exactly.
yeah,
What is
absolutely.
this trash?
Yeah.
And for me, almost immediately, it probably was immediately, but your mind changes, right?
Oh, totally.
When in trauma. But it seemed like a few seconds into it where I was hit, which I remember. This is one thing that you and I talked about, because I remember saying something like, I screamed like a little girl, and you were like, "Nah, you sounded like you stubbed your toe," or something. So I don't know if you were just saying that to make me feel better, but I don't know. But what do you remember from, like, okay, so like you said, the gunfire started, like, what then?
Yeah, I mean, first thing is after it kind of, it went away as fast as it came, right? I mean, it was just like this blast of, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, I'm going to say 3 to 5 seconds. I don't know, maybe it was longer or shorter, but that's just kind of what it felt like.
Sure.
And I just remember the whole aircraft shaking. I mean, at that point, just the initial. So I'll tell you what kicked in. Dave Wilson and Forrest Sims kicked in. Is what they did, because both of them were instructor pilots. Dave was a sacred cow back then in 117 and 182. Great, one of the greatest instructor pilots I ever flew with. He had been involved, like, in, he had a long career and had accidents and had stuff shot at him, and just, as every Army aviator does. And he taught you during RL progression, fly the aircraft, no matter what, fly the aircraft, right? And then, so that was ingrained in my head. And then, I don't know if you remember, this was maybe 6 to 8 months before we deployed. Forrest and Candace were doing FADEC work out in McCall, and they crashed, right? And I remember we rolled up to the scene. And for those of you that know anything about Fort Bragg, McCall is about, an hour and a half drive from the airfield, right? So if you couldn't get a ride, you just heard one of your aircraft crashed, your crew might be banged up, and like you got to wait an hour to get there, kind of thing. But we went out there; they were fine. But I remember them saying one of the reasons that helped them, basically, they were able to get to the runway to kind of grease it on, was fly the aircraft. When you think the aircraft won't fly anymore, keep flying the aircraft. And when you really don't think it'll fly anymore, keep flying the aircraft. Don't give up on it. So I just remember at that point, all the caution warnings were going off inside the cockpit. So, I mean, the headset's blazing, right? Ears are still ringing. I'm kind of looking out of one eye because all the gunpowder and dust and stuff's in my, kind of thing, even though I was properly wearing my visor for all the safety officers out there.
Absolutely.
100%. And I just remember, okay, flight, like, is this thing flying? Like, and I just remember just acking everything off, just hitting the acknowledgement, just shutting everything up. And it was very quick. It was, okay, is the aircraft flying? Yes, it is. Okay. And then I remember asking if you were okay. And you were, at the time, you were like, we were both kind of flustered. And I think you basically got it like, yeah, I'm good kind of thing. And then I went back to the aircraft to look at, all the chicklets and see, okay, are we losing rotor? Are we losing oil pressure? All that. And it was, you can fault the Kiowa all you want. That thing, I mean, Brian, you were the TAC ops guy. That thing took, I don't even know how many bullets, rounds, rotor system, engine, fuel cell, everything. It kept flying. That thing, like, kept flying right through it.
Yeah, I've actually got some pictures. We'll pull it up here in a second, Jake, so just get ready. But yeah, I remember getting hit, and for me it was this weird, like, I hate to make this sound like, I'm not trying to blow it out of proportion or make it sound like fancy. For me, it was like an out of body experience. And I think that's just your brain, like, saying, nope, you don't want to be here for this type, just for a moment. Because I swear to God, I remember getting hit almost immediately, just bang, bang, bang. Oh my God, there's something happening. Ouch, that hurts. And I feel like I was behind the aircraft, like literally looking down from behind as if I was a ghost or some shit. And I think it was just my mind just being like, nope, just for a second, like, get away from this. Okay, cool. And then just kind of zipping back in. And I remember the aircraft pitching forward pretty drastically. At least it seemed like at the time. Again, we're very low, so it doesn't take much to like, okay, the ground is coming very fast. And of course, the gunning, the sound came from the right side, and you were sitting on my right. So my first thought was, you're dead. Like that immediately, I was like, he's dead, because if they hit me, they had to have hit him. We're pitching forward dramatically. And so my arm still worked at the time. I didn't start seizing up yet. I reached for the controls. Just like you said, yeah, fly the aircraft. Pretty quickly, I could immediately tell that you were, in control. And it's funny because we're describing all this stuff as if it took a really long time. We're talking about like 3 seconds, like all of this shit just happened so fast, and your mind just slows down, and things just happen at an increased pace. So I knew that you were in control, and then I got scared because I thought, okay, cool, he's in control, but I still feel like we're going down and no one's around right now. And that's when I was like, that's the really like the nervous part. It was like, we're going to survive this crash so that we can end up on Al Jazeera or something, like that's what I was terrified of. But, you were in control, and you were essentially diving to get more speed and to, evade fire and get away. But I mean, we just, and we're gone. And I do remember saying something like, I'm hit, get us out of here, or something like that. And then, yeah, you checked on me. And so now we're flying away, and you're trying to call them. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, and just like you said, it goes quick. So it was like, okay, something really awful just happened. Fly the aircraft, check on Brian, aircraft still flying. And oh, by the way, in my head, I'm kind of like wiggling my feet and like, kind of, just whatever, right? Adrenaline's pumping. But then the next thing was like, okay, whatever we just went through, hopefully our trail aircraft didn't go hopefully it didn't.
Yeah.
So normally every ounce of your scout pilot says, okay, we're going to get away, we're going to turn around, and then we're going to come back and shoot whoever shot at us. Like that's step 1, 2, 3. That's what we're going to do. And I remember the aircraft was kind of beat up. We were still kind of unsure what we were doing. So next step was, link up with the sister aircraft, trail aircraft. Let's get our shit together, and then let's go back in and let's go lay waste to this stuff. And I remember trying to call them, couldn't get them. I think we switched radios a couple times, couldn't get them. And so now, I don't know, it seemed like the two of us had like the moment of clarity at like the same time that like, shit, like what if they got shot down? Right. Yeah. So now we gotta and so, if I remember correctly, we kind of made a wide sweeping turn to visually look. We saw them, but basically they got hit really bad too. Luckily, I don't think their cockpit got hit. I don't think those guys got hit, but like the rotors got shot up and like their avionics got shot, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, Jake, why don't you pull up the photos, because it'll answer some of that. You got it? There we go. All right, so that was the aircraft 115, and I think by the count, because Bo did the TAC op stuff. Obviously, I was not up for it, but I think the count was between 13 and 15 rounds. So to put that into context, most of our aircraft, when they came back, had 4 or 5 rounds hit. In fact, before this one, the one I remember was Balls 4, and I think they had 9 rounds hit, maybe 10. And that was a big number. I remember that. In fact, I think that's the one you referred to where
Jim McDonough, I think.
Jim McDonough got shot in the back of the helmet, which I think was the day after Matt Mattingly was killed. And so it was like, we were all like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
So for us, this was a ton of, and also, if you'll remember, most aircraft back then came back with holes, like you said, in the tail boom. These were all forward half of the aircraft. So this is inside, go back, Jake. This is inside kind of the back side of where the rotor pops out. So you're looking at one of the pitch change links there, with the rotor off to the right. Okay, go to the next one. So there's actual like swash plate, bullet hole. Go ahead, go next. So that's in front of me. That's that big holster thing that we had for our M4. So our M4s would slide up into that holster, and that's just blown out there. Go to the next one. So this one's interesting, because that's what you were holding. And
Yeah.
you got it. I mean, you got a little scratch, didn't you? You got a little boo boo.
Yeah, it's like I say, I can't say I survived the wars without a scratch. But I mean, literally, that's what it was. Like I remember somebody started writing the Purple Heart paperwork, and I was like, stop, 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 like just stop it, right? It literally, yeah. So basically, for any Kiowa pilots watching this, there were two ways that you held the collective. There was the right way and the wrong way, and then there was the way that everybody held it. And so the right way is if you kind of see up near the control head there looks like kind of like it's like a grip, right? And that's your throttle. And the way you're supposed to fly is you would have your left hand holding that throttle the whole time, and that's what you would pull up and down on the collective with. And the idea was that if you had to use the throttle for an emergency procedure, something like that, your hand was already on it, right? The other way was how most people flew. Is imagine just kind of flat palming over the top of the control head, and a lot of ways that's how a lot of folks flew. At the time, that's how I was flying. So really, my arm was running down the collective, and where you see that bullet hole coming up, my arm was just kind of to the right of that, right? So I think like one of the pieces of metal came up and like scratched my arm, right? But had I have been holding it the normal way, where my hand was wrapped around that my forearm would have been closer to the bottom of it, and probably, I mean, would have probably had a similar wound like yours. You know what I mean? Or coming through,
or worse. Yeah, because it all went through there. In fact, if you look, if you draw a line straight down from that hole, you see another hole in your seat. So that bullet went straight up under your ass. And of course, the collective wasn't laying down like that; it was up when it went through. And in fact, I remember the rotor spiking pretty hard, the mass torque spiking pretty hard when we got shot up. And as I think about it, it's probably because a fucking bullet went through the collective, right? And pushed it up,
or me, like just scared shitless,
right.
I mean,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Because one of the things too, and I guess a credit really to Dave Wilson, like you said, is muscle memory. Here I am, very clearly shot, very clearly thinking the aircraft's going to crash. I think the first thing I did after I realized you were still in control is I went to the page. I don't even remember what page it is anymore, to check the mass torque, because that's what you always did when because you're like, well, I hope we didn't over torque,
Exactly.
Who cares? It could be 180. I don't give a shit. Like, is it still flying? Exactly. But I'm going to check and make sure that we don't have to do any write-ups. But that's just the muscle memory takes over, because that's what you do. Okay. But yeah, so interesting enough that you weren't holding it at the throttle grip, and lucky, because I think it would have gone through like your wrist or something.
Probably.
I mean, shit, you could have lost your hand.
So don't tell the folks at AMCOM, but I still have that collective. And every once in a while, like, because that aircraft went back in a box, right? They just packed it up and shipped it back. Who knows whatever happened with it. But I was like, guys, the collective's not going with it. And the crew chiefs went and yanked it out for me. Because I was like, yeah, that's coming with me. And every once in a while, I'll put my hand on it and be like, yeah, good thing I was holding it the wrong way. I mean, it's crazy to think that way, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is back behind you, quite a ways behind you, but we got the big black boxes. That was all the avionics and stuff. I think this is why we couldn't talk to Trail, if I remember correctly, because that was our radio. Because we were talking to them on an FM radio. Of course, at the time, we had 4 radios in the aircraft. We had 2 FM, a UHF, and a VHF. We had the FM, one of the FMs talking to them, another FM tuned up for whatever ground unit we were at. Which I could not get a word in edgewise with those guys, because I do remember trying to call them to tell them that we had just been shot up, and they were having like some sort of bullshit meeting or something on their radio, and I just gave up. I was like, all right, forget this.
Shift change or something like that.
Yeah, I remember distinctly Alpha Company needed MREs. I do remember that, because I was just like, I'm bleeding out here, and you're talking about MREs and I was deaf. I'll tell you what, for the rest of my career, I was deaf on people using the command net for logistics. I was like, you have an A&L net, that's what that shit's for, because when Johnny's out there getting blown up, he is not waiting to hear you talk about MREs. So that was one of the things I always drilled into people when I was teaching. But but that radio, as I recall, this was the radio. I could be completely wrong. I'm sure someone will at me if I am. But they called us. So yeah, you said, and I remember this because it was like, it was hard for me. It was very conflicting, because yes, of course we have to go look for them. The other part of me was like, God, I just want to go home. Like, I don't know how bad I'm hurt. I just know it hurts like hell. Because I remember you turning to me and I remember like the tone of your voice. You're like, we got to go back. And I was like, and I didn't say nothing, but in my mind I was like, oh, I really don't want to go back. And you started turning left, and I remember grabbing, like, we didn't have doors on. Me grabbing the frame of the aircraft and kind of pulling myself as much as I
Mm-hmm.
could to turn around and look behind me. And yeah, they were just like right up behind us, tucked
Yep.
in. And I was like, oh, thank God. I was like, okay, yeah, they're there. And then they called us on the VHF because we were all listening to VHF on tower. That was just the tower
Right. Yeah.
frequency for Missoula. And they called and they were like, hey, we just took fire. And you were like, yeah, no shit. So did we. And I remember Cody, you must have said something. I think you said something like, yeah, no shit. So did we. Brian's hit. Because I remember Cody telling me later that he thought what you meant was I was dead.
Oh,
Just
okay. Wow. Okay.
because of the history of people getting shot at that point on that deployment.
Right. Yeah.
Matt was the only one at that time, and he unfortunately deceased. So yeah, so I remember Cody telling me that. He was like, in his head, he's like, he thought I was dead. And I think at some point I said something on the radio, and then they were like, oh, okay, cool, all right, cool. So we started that left turn, looking back, we saw them, and then that's when you started that right turn south and circled around the city back to Missoula, which is, or the Diamondback, which is only about a 5-minute flight, if that, something like that. What do you remember anything going on with that?
I do remember, there was still, I can't remember if we had a team conversation about it or not, about like, going back and trying to engage him, whatever. But I don't remember if we did or not. But I do remember once we saw that, we visually saw him, started talking to him, at the time, and, as the AMC, I was like, okay, look, I got one guy that's hit, the aircraft are shot up. That's not, I mean, like, okay, if this was really, really bad, where we had ground guys maybe getting shot at, or, something like that, right? Okay, we'll go in and we'll see what we can do. But I just remember at that point being like, two banged up aircraft, got a guy shot. There's no ground forces out whatsoever to help us. You know what I mean? So even if we went in and laid the perfect rocket shots in and then crashed 200 feet away because the engine gave out, right? There's, because you're right. I mean, that was part of our pre-mission briefs about how to not, die on Al Jazeera. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
So I just remember, I think we all made a very quick call. We're heading back. And at that point, literally I just hauled ass. At that point, I knew the aircraft was a goner anyway. So I pulled in as much torque as I could and, just made sure those guys could keep up. And then, I just remember coming in, doing a really long, like having to haul ass, because I think the adrenaline was wearing off, and you were telling me like how bad your arm hurt. And the other part that was messed up is, this is December, we're flying with no doors on, and we had those puffy winter jackets on, right? And so I just remember looking down, and like both like your right arm and my left arm had blood all over it. And we didn't know whose it was. And we were like, because the adrenaline and everything's going. So as it was dying off, I remember you telling me your arm was really hurting. And luckily we had the cash there, right? That, was, you were able to go right in. But I just remember doing a big long approach, kind of skidded it in because I didn't know if that thing was going to quit or not. And then, the really good medics and doctors, man, they did their thing, man. They were out there. EMS was out there, and, they did their job.
Yeah, so here's just an X-ray, of me, and you can see there's some stuff at the elbow and stuff in the upper arm. Okay, Jake, you can take it back to whatever. Yeah, I remember the blood thing because you were flying back, and I remember you just like holding your arm up, and and it was like so matter of fact the way you said it. You're like, "Is that your blood or mine?" And I was like, "I don't know." And I remember you telling me, and maybe I misremember, but I remember you telling me that when you started to get scared for me is when I told you I couldn't feel my arm anymore, like it was getting cold. And essentially, what's happening when you have trauma like that is, your body starts to seal off that area, right? So all the arteries and veins start to close up because it's basically making a natural tourniquet. And people have asked me, well, why didn't you put a tourniquet on? One, you don't think clearly necessarily in those situations, because that was shock. Like, we were not in a gunfight. Like, we were straight up ambushed, like everything. We were fat, dumb, and happy, and then suddenly chaos happens. Like, that's a very different environment than when you're in a gunfight and stuff is happening and then you get hit. I think it's just very different the way it affects your psyche. Sure. But two, like you said, it was cold as shit that day. We're wearing heavy jackets. I remember I had that that brown undergarment garment type thing. I had the
Yeah.
heavy ass jacket. Like, you can't put a tourniquet on that anyway. It would have never
Yeah.
really worked.
Yeah.
But we were close enough to the airfield that we were going to get there fast. I remember like cursing you under my breath at one point about, you asked me to turn the sight off as
Yeah.
we were getting close, and you were like, hey, go ahead and turn off the sight. And I'm just like, what the why? Like, who cares? But you told me, I don't know if you do you remember why you told me to do that?
Yeah, it was just to take. It was a stupid, simple thing. You know, it was part of the pre-landing check, right? That, you know, you turn the MMS off, and I just remember your. I was generally concerned about your arm because, like, again,
Sure.
we had kind of done these rudimentary training things because in the Kiowa, I mean, literally, like me and Brian, like our like, it was not uncommon for you to come out with like the other guy's patch on your Velcro because you were just, you know, like squished up against each other. And so we had done these kind of drills where like you would grab, maybe not a tourniquet, but you would grab your pressure dressing that was kind of prepped, and you'd squash it and push your arm, you know, anything you could do to kind of control bleeding. But there was no clear anything going on, right? Just because, you know, again, puffy stuff, and it's like, we'll be there soon. But I was really starting to get concerned when you said you couldn't feel anymore. So I just told you to do the pre-landing check just to give you something to think about. Like,
Right.
that's all it was, you know.
Yeah.
You know, sight, whatever, no big deal. But it was just something, even if it only for 10 seconds, you know, whatever. But apparently your rage took over your pain, and that worked too. So you're welcome, even to this day.
Well, my rifle was called Righteous Indignation, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
But yeah, so I remember that. And then I remember us getting back to Missoula. And we kind of did like this midfield entry, and came down, and you just kind of raced along the runway because the cache, the combat surgical hospital, was down at the end of the runway. And I remember as we crossed the berm or the wire or whatever, Cody called and was like, hey, I think you guys are on fire. I don't know if you remember that, but I was like,
I kind of remember. Yeah.
Well, essentially what happens, because we took, I think, 5 rounds in the fuel cell. And so it was, and it's, as I tell people, it stops becoming a self-sealing fuel cell at 3 rounds. Because the thing was like leaking like a sieve. I remember getting out of the aircraft and just fuel was just pouring out of the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what I think was happening though is as we were cruising along, fuel is leaking out. It's then vaporizing in the air. So it looks like a cloud. And so he thought we were on fire or something. Because I remember just looking down at the instruments and seeing that we were over the runway, and I was like, I don't give a shit. Like, we're good. Like, we're going to land, and I'm going to get out of this, and this nightmare is going to end. So you go cruising down the end of the runway. I do remember the crew chiefs talking to us later because, of course, they don't know what's going on. They just see 258s that normally land, taxi into the parking area, blow hauling ass 90 knots down the runway. And I can't remember who it was who said something like it looked like stuff was falling off the aircraft. It looked like parts were falling off. Like, it's probably just one of those like in the mine things or something, but they could tell something was off. So you go skidding down into the cache. I do remember that. And right next to the cache, that's where the medevac Blackhawks were, as I recall. And so no one knew, because I guess you called Tower and told them what was going on. I don't even remember that, honestly. Did you call Tower?
Yeah, we called Tower, declared emergency, and then Cody and Boots called back to the talk to let them know. So
okay,
there were folks there. I mean, I remember it wasn't a complete surprise. Like when we landed, I remember like the fire trucks weren't there waiting. I think they were maybe a little bit behind, but the cache folks were there. I remember like they were pretty much right there when we landed, kind of thing, or maybe that was just in my mind, but.
Yeah, I think they showed up very soon after, and because I remember the first person that showed up was one of the medevac crew chiefs had run over, and I don't know why, maybe just the strangeness of what was going on, but I remember he ran over. You had done like an emergency shutdown, so the blades were still spinning, but they were slowing down. I couldn't get out of the aircraft because I couldn't my hand or my arm at this point just didn't work. And of course, I'm still just in like a panic. At this point, I just want to get out of the aircraft because my biggest fear at this point was losing my arm. Like, I don't know what, it was just one of those things where it's like, I do not want to lose my arm. We used to strap our M4s to ourselves. Some of us did. I don't know if you did, but I know I did that day. My M4, we had those like elastic sort of like straps. And so the M4, because you didn't want to drop your M4 out the door.
Yep.
And so we had them kind of dummy corded to us essentially, and I couldn't get it off. And I just remember just being so frustrated. And I look at this guy, and he's like standing right outside of the rotor disc as it's slowing down, he's just kind of looking at us. And I just remember like yelling, like, get me out of this thing. And so he runs over, and I remember helping me unstrap. And I think that's right about when they showed up, and then with the stretcher, and then I laid down on a stretcher, and I remember getting peeled away. And I remember the first thing I asked the doctor was, am I going to lose my arm? And I swear to God, he said, no, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. And that made me feel so much better. I think about it now. He didn't know shit. Like, he probably just said that just to like calm me down, you know, but in real life, he's like, I don't know.
Lottery, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so they wheel me back, and then I guess at that point, I guess Cody lands next to you guys, and you guys came in, because I know you came in pretty quick after. They were still like ripping all my stuff off when you guys were there.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know anything about what happened from your guys' standpoint at that point.
Yeah. So I mean, pretty much we shut the aircraft down really quick, and we were probably a minute or two behind you, right? Because once they kind of had you and went in, we're like, okay, he's in better hands than he was in 5 minutes ago or 5 seconds ago. So we just made sure everything was shut down. I went over to talk to Cody and Aaron real quick just to make sure they were okay. And then at that point, all three of us just went in, right, to check in. And I vaguely kind of remember how the ER was laid out. I remember they had you in the thing and they were working on your arm. And they were, obviously we're all like, how's it going? And I remember at that point, Colonel Pyatt came, who was our squadron commander at the time, right? Some other folks had come in because they heard what was going on. And so it wasn't more than probably maybe like 5 minutes, maybe it's 10 minutes. I don't know. But basically one of the doctors or nurses had come over and said, hey, he's got some, bullet wounds / shrapnel wound in his arm. That's it. Because I mean, again, who knows? Like maybe you took one in the leg and you didn't know because your arm hurt more or whatever. So they basically said that. So everybody was kind of like, okay, everybody kind of calmed down a little bit. And then they did a quick check on me. Like they were like, you have to get looked at. Okay, fine. And there wasn't anything. So we just hung out until there was a wait time. I think they went in. I can't remember that. I don't know if they put you in surgery or if they just kind of picked stuff out as they went. I don't know how that went for you. But then the next thing I really remember is meeting you kind of after they had treated you and you're kind of in recovery, I guess. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's really the next thing I remember.
Yeah. I recall you guys coming in because they were laying me on the stretcher and moving me around, trying to get all my stuff off. They're cutting all my uniform off and everything. And they did the rectal thermometer. I remember this because I remember knowing you were in the room. And I tried to make a joke for you. And you know what joke I tried to use. I'm sure of it. You're thinking of Fletch. You use a little hand there, Doc? Oh, yeah. And I tried so hard. Exactly. I tried so hard to get that out. And I was too messed up. I was too choked up. Right. But I remember I got like half of it out. And, but I do remember that. And then them wheeling me back to do, because I went into surgery right after that. They put me out. But I remember being wheeled out, and the last memory I even have before that surgery was looking at Cody, because they wheeled me right past him. And Cody's just a good old boy. I'd love to have him on the show. I was actually, we'll talk later. I was just talking to him a couple days ago. We'll talk offline, but he's fine. But he's one of those like unflappable dudes, right? He's just the good old boy from West Virginia. And I remember the look on his face was just like, he just couldn't believe what was going on. And I cried. Like, I just seeing him like that, just like all the emotion came out. And I just remember crying and getting wheeled back. And then, and the next thing I remember is hearing, because I'm sure you've been in surgery before, you know how it is. Like when you start coming out of anesthesia, you hear stuff first. Like you're not looking around. You just start being aware of things going on. And the first thing I remember being aware of is hearing a woman's voice say, well, can I get a picture with him? And I don't even have my eyes open. I know nothing. I'm like, yes. I don't know why I know it's for me, but I know it's for me. And I guess it turned out one of the like National Guard Black Hawk crew chiefs was also like Miss Hawaii or wherever the hell they were from. Something like that.
I kind of remember that.
She had like her banner, like her little sash and everything. And so she came over and took a picture with me. It was weird. But and then it started the path to recovery, and that's when you guys would come to visit. And it was so funny too, because I know everybody had the best intentions of coming to see me, but I also know that there was an underlying theme to what people wanted. It was Christmas morning, and back then, guys didn't have cell phones on deployment. You didn't, the cell phone technology wasn't really the way it is now. So the base was shut down. Nobody could make phone calls until I had a chance to call home. And so
Oh,
people were
that's
coming.
right. Oh, that's right. Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember people were coming to me and I'm like, hey man, how you doing? I remember Deuce in particular just coming to me like, hey man, how you doing? Yeah. Hey, you called home yet? And I'm just like, no man, it's
Yeah.
like 6 a.m. back home. Like, just give me a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but no, that's funny. Well, at any rate, yeah, I just kind of wanted to bounce that off each other. It doesn't sound like either of us have too crazy of different memories
Yeah.
of it. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
I will say the one thing that always stuck with me, and I don't know if I ever told you the story, not that it's anything great, whatever, but that during that whole time, you all the things that we just talked about, you don't really think about what happened, right? And then obviously when we're in the hospital, you start to think, and it's very real because it's right there. But when it hit me was eventually I went back to, they had wheeled the aircraft back and had started doing their stuff, whatever. And one of I forget which one of the crew chiefs is like, hey, he's like, hey, sir, I don't like, do you just want us to close the logbook out for you? Like, what, because when you get done flying, we had laptops that you'd log the flight and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I just remember being like, no, man, I got it. I don't want you like, it's my aircraft. I'll do it. Right. Kind of thing, whatever. And I remember I sat there and I don't know if the software still does it this way, but when you go in and you put your flight time, which I did log your flight time for you. It asks you when you hit enter, it says, was this flight okay? Like a box pops up. It says, was this flight okay? And that's when I went, son of a bitch. Like, and then everything started to unravel. Like that happened. And I was like, no, and then that's where you would put all your faults in,
Right.
So that was, and then the day, like a week later, I got my jacket back from the laundry and I was looking at it to see if there was any, they did a pretty good job. They got the stains out, but then I saw literally I took a pencil and there was a hole that went in the wrist and it went up and like came out of the elbow.
Really?
Like from where where the bullet hole in the collective was, it went in the jacket for probably about that far and came out.
Oh shit. Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't give it back to CIF. I kept
it. Yeah, that brings a funny story. Yeah, I knew you logged it because somebody wrote it in my paper logbook. Because remember, we used to keep a paper logbook. It was either you or Forrest. I think it was Forrest who logged it for me, and we logged an hour. Even though I'm pretty sure we didn't fly an hour.
Exactly.
That's okay. We just rounded up. But in the notes, remember we had like a note section, and he just wrote "ouch" with an exclamation mark. So, but I knew that the flight was logged, and that's what's important. And I think he gave me PIC time for that, so that was good.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
The other cool thing, I should have taken a picture so I could post it up. Behind me is a little shadow box. In fact, I'll see if I can move. That my wife actually made, but it's got our team photo. But if you remember, you were flying flags that day.
Yes.
We used to fly those flags around in the box, and you had 4 or 5 of them, I think, just stacked up behind me on one of the avionics boxes, and they got shot up. And you sent me one. So I was home, I don't know, a couple months at some point, and I get a package from you from Iraq, and it's one of these. And I don't know if I ever told you this. I don't know. Maybe you knew, maybe you didn't, but I knew you knew it had a bullet hole in it. There was a hole in the flag, and shrapnel literally fell out of the box when I opened it. Yeah, it goes like, oh, like pieces of metal came out. So that was pretty cool as well. But yeah, CIF, I remember all of my clothes were just soaked in blood, so they had to get rid of them. But when I tried to clear Fort Bragg, months later, no one had done a flipple, and I didn't think about it. At that point, yeah, exactly. I was literally like 2 days from leaving, and I was trying to turn stuff in, and they're like, "Well, where's this uniform at?" And I'm like, "I mean, I was shot. It's coated in blood." And the CIF guy, this old crusty, he's like, "Well, just bring it in a plastic bag." I'm like, no, dude, like it's gone. Like, it was a biohazard. It's been
Yeah,
burned.
exactly. Yeah.
And that's when everyone realized, like, oh, we never did a flipple on this guy. So
Yeah.
so they jumped through their hoops, and which is a field loss or a property loss for people who don't know what I'm talking about. Basically, just signing off that I'm not responsible for getting shot. Sorry, I ruined your uniform with my blood.